Malcolm X was one of the most influential black men to have ever walked the earth. He might have been controversial at times, but there is no denying the fact that Malcolm cared deeply about the liberation of black people and the advancement of his race. Something that may be less known is the fact that Malcolm was heavily influenced by several freedom fighters and trailblazers in the fight against racial oppression and stigmatization. And when you consider who these people were themselves, you'd see how their influences helped to shape who Malcolm ended up being. This is the story of Malcolm Little, the freedom fighter, as well as the sources from which he drew his inspiration, from Jamaica to Ethiopia. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in May 1925, Malcolm X, or Malcolm Little as his government name stated, was the fourth of 7 children. His father, Earl Little, was born in Georgia, while his mother, Louise Helen, was born in Grenada. Earl was noted as an outspoken Baptist lay speaker, but the real inspiration behind both him and Louise Helen was Marcus Garvey. Remember him? For those who might not know, Marcus was a Jamaican political activist who founded and served as the first president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Marcus had been born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, but he had to leave his country and move to the United Kingdom in the early 1900s. In the UK, Marcus soon became politically conscious, asking questions about the origins of the black man's government and looking for ways to bring this government into the world on his own. In 1914, he boarded a ship back to his homeland, and 1 year later, the United Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Communities League were born. It didn't take long before the messages being extolled by Garvey and his followers began to spread across borders. And as it turned out, Earl and Helen Louise were amongst Garvey's most ardent followers. In fact, Earl served as the local leader for the Universal Negro Improvement Association, while Helen Louise served as secretary and branch reporter, sending news of local UNIA activities to Negro World, the official newspaper of the UNIA. So, it should come as no surprise that the two were heavy on inculcating the themes of self-reliance and black pride in their children. And now, we see where Malcolm really started getting his ideology from. Things would get even stronger for Malcolm. Just a year after he was born, Malcolm's family and the entire UNIA in Nebraska were threatened by members of the Ku Klux Klan, who claimed that they were causing trouble. So, the family moved to Milwaukee, and then to Lansing, Michigan. Even there, Malcolm's family was constantly harassed by the Black Legion, a white racist group Earl accused of burning their home in 1929. When Malcolm was 6, his father died in what has been officially ruled a streetcar accident. However, his mother continued to believe that Earl had been killed by the Black Legion. These rumors claiming that Earl had been the victim of a hate crime spread like wildfire, and for young Malcolm, they were incredibly disturbing. And to make matters worse, his mother had apparently been cheated out of her life insurance policy of $18 per month after the issuer of the policy refused to pay on the grounds that Earl had committed suicide. Life went pretty smoothly in the 30s for the Little family, all until a man that Helen Louise had been seeing reportedly vanished from her life when she became pregnant with his child. This was her 8th child, and the very last thing she wanted was to be involved with a man who would turn out to be an absentee father. The trauma was too much for her, and she had a nervous breakdown, being committed to Kalamazoo State Hospital. With no one else left to take care of them, Malcolm and his siblings were soon separated and sent to foster homes. And this would be where things would take a turn for Malcolm. In his new life, Malcolm attended West Junior High School in Lansing and Mason High School in Michigan. While he excelled in junior high, he eventually dropped out of school after he was told by a white teacher that his dream of being a lawyer was far too unrealistic for a, quote, nigger. Later on, Malcolm would recall that this made him feel that the white world offered no place for a career-oriented black man, regardless of his hard work or natural talent. From the age of 14 to 21, Malcolm held a series of jobs while living with his half-sister Ella Little Collins. He eventually moved to Harlem in 1943, the same area where the headquarters of the UNIA of Marcus Garvey was located 20 years before. There he worked on the New Haven Railroad and began engaging in different crimes: robbers, racketeering, gambling, and all sorts of bad stuff. When he was summoned by the local draft board for military service in World War II, Malcolm feigned mental disturbance and was eventually declared mentally unfit for military service. He returned to Boston in 1945, where he and his accomplices went on a stealing spree. A year later, Malcolm was arrested while picking up a stolen watch and sentenced to 8 to 10 years at Charlestown State Prison on charges of larceny and breaking. 2 years later, he was transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony. Interestingly, prison would be what changed Malcolm's life. He met fellow convict John Bembry, who was a self-educated man. With Bembry's influence, Malcolm soon built a ravenous appetite for reading. At this time as well, several of Malcolm's siblings had written to him about the Nation of Islam, a new religious movement that had been preaching the same values of self-reliance and black pride that Malcolm had heard in his younger days, under the influence of Marcus Garvey. He soon began dreaming of a day when Africans in the diaspora would return to their homeland, where they would be free from white European and American dominance. Things got so intense for Malcolm that he stopped eating pork and smoking cigarettes. However, Malcolm was also said to have taken things to the extreme, believing that all white people had inherently been predisposed to dishonesty, injustice, and greed. Malcolm had already been hostile to Christians in prison, so it seemed that he was already more receptive to the message of the Nation of Islam. In late 1948, Malcolm wrote to Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, who advised him to renounce his past and humbly succumb to God. Soon after, Malcolm became a full-fledged member of the Nation of Islam, while also maintaining constant communication with Muhammad. 2 years later, in 1950, Malcolm, in a letter to President Truman from prison, began signing his name as Malcolm X, following an instruction from Muhammad to leave their family names behind after joining the Nation of Islam. In his autobiography, Malcolm X explained that the X symbolized the true African family name that he could never know, explaining, "For me, my X replaced the white slave master name of Little, which some blue-eyed devil named Little had imposed upon my paternal forebears." In general, Malcolm was widely regarded as the second most influential leader of the Nation of Islam. Some even contend that he soon became more of an influence than Muhammad. He alone was credited with growing the group significantly, with membership surging from about 1,200 in the early 50s to about 100,000 by the time the 60s rolled around. Malcolm also inspired the conversion of Muhammad Ali, who joined the nation in the 60s. The two did fall out after Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, but even Muhammad Ali claimed later that this fallout was one of his biggest regrets. At the same time, Malcolm mentored and guided Louis X, who would later be known as Louis Farrakhan and who would end up leading the Nation of Islam. Of course, we all know how things ended with Malcolm and the Nation. They had a falling out in the early 60s thanks in no small part to what Malcolm believed to have been the nation's apathy after several of its members had been harassed by the LAPD. Malcolm sought Muhammad's approval for what he termed a violent response against the police, but Muhammad blocked him. From then on, things started getting a bit frosty between the two leaders. At the same time, there were also rumors of sexual misbehavior by Muhammad, which incensed Malcolm even more. Add these to Malcolm's incendiary comments on the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the fact that Malcolm had become a bigger star than Muhammad himself, and you can see how things soon turned sour between them. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm officially announced his break from the Nation of Islam. Although he remained a Muslim, he believed that the nation had become outdated with rigid teachings. He planned to organize a black nationalist organization that would heighten the political consciousness of African Americans without regard for their religion. He even expressed a desire to work with other civil rights leaders, something he claimed he couldn't do before due to Muhammad's prevention. At the same time, a wave of independence swept across Africa during the 60s. For anyone who's ever claimed to be focused on the liberation of African Americans, there is always a hunger to extend this to the motherland. And Malcolm X was absolutely no different. He had already visited Egypt, Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana in 1959. But in his second and third travel, not as a representative of the Nation of Islam, he would end up taking a lot of inspiration from the African continent. In 1964, after traveling to different African countries like the ones that he already knows, plus Ethiopia, Senegal, and Gambia, among others, Malcolm, with the help of his close friend, Dr. John Henrique Clark, helped to establish the Organization of AfroAmerican Unity, a Pan-Africanist organization that was molded on the Organization of African Unity, or OAU. The OAU, later known as the African Union, was founded in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963 by 32 important African leaders, including Haile Selassie from Ethiopia, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, and Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt. This organization was born from the unification promoted by Haile Selassie of the Casablanca and Monrovia groups for a common cause. the eradication of colonialism and neocolonialism from the African continent, as well as the political and economic integration of its member states. The Organization of AfroAmerican Unity was established at a public meeting in New York's Audubon Ballroom in June of 1964. In the first public address on behalf of the organization, Malcolm recognizes it has been patterned after the letter and the spirit of its African predecessor. Amongst the organization's many objectives were fighting for the human rights of African Americans, the restoration of Afro-American and African communication and dialogue, the reorientation of Africans and Afro-Americans through proper education, and ensuring the economic security of Afro-Americans in the diaspora in African countries, many of whom were just getting their independence from colonial masters. The organization also pushed for black control in every aspect of black communities, while at the same time promoting African American participation in voting, education, and housing. Malcolm X saw the OAAU as a way of unbrainwashing black people, ridding them of the lies they had been told about themselves and their culture. In July 1964, 1 month after his inauguration speech in New York, Malcolm was welcomed at the second meeting of the Organization of African Unity in El Cairo as a representative of the newly formed Afro-American organization. His speech in front of the heads of state of the African continent was about human rights violations that Afro-Americans were facing on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Malcolm actually did a lot of work in Africa after leaving the Nation of Islam. He gave a lot of speeches in different countries. On one such visit, Malcolm met Kwame Nkrumah. The visit happened in 1964, and there was significant opposition to Malcolm himself. Now, to be fair, Malcolm and Kwame had met back in 1958 when Kwame visited Harlem following Ghana's independence. And according to exhaustive records, the two had remained close, sharing correspondence and communicating regularly. So when Malcolm visited Ghana in 1964, he was definitely going to see his friend. Interestingly, the CIA had expressed their displeasure about Malcolm's Ghana visit to Nkrumah, and they even made it clear that they did not want him to give Malcolm any form of audience. But Nkrumah wasn't just about to leave his friend hanging. The two met, although neither of them revealed much about what was discussed. That said, there was another meeting, one which was also under heavy scrutiny from the CIA. Even though they didn't reveal much about their meetings, we know for sure that Malcolm had been impressed by his experience with Nkrumah. He called his meeting with the former Ghanaian president the highest honor of his life, and he even went on to label Ghana the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism. Now, interestingly, Nkrumah did eventually reveal to author Julia Wright that he received credible intelligence that the US government was planning to have Malcolm assassinated once he left Ghana and returned to American shores. The former president confirmed that he shared this intelligence with Malcolm, who received it with dignity and resignation. Also, Nkrumah explained that he would have very much preferred if Malcolm stayed in Ghana and helped to build the Pan-Africanist work he was engaging in. He continued his work, visiting different countries and raising public consciousness about politics. However, his work was short-lived. Just 1 year after leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm was killed at a public event in Manhattan. An autopsy report identified about 21 gunshot wounds to his chest, left shoulder, arms, and legs, showing that he had little to no chance of surviving the encounter. Even though he's been dead for 60 years, Malcolm X remains one of the most influential black men to ever live. And it's easy to see how much of his work was inspired by a fellow Pan-Africanist, Marcus Garvey, by the father of African unity, and by the different leaders of African liberation.